Yo, what's going on, guys? It's me, Jay. I know a lot of my viewers, a lot of my subscribers are watching SummerSlam. You know what I mean? So I'm gonna keep this video pretty short and sweet. But I promised you guys the other day that I was gonna talk about um, Trump's meeting with three black journalists from the uh, Black Journalists Association. Hey, Lisa, what's going on? And that's what we're gonna hear to talk about. I feel like this interview was a death nail in Trump's coffin politically because the angle that he took was really a bad angle. If you look at the trajectory, obviously, when Trump announced last year that he was going to run again for president of the United States after losing the way that he lost in 2020 and then helping to engineer the first coup in American history in 2021, people were like, oh, well, I don't know if I'll vote for him again. They were on the fence. And then Biden, he and Biden have the debate. And then Biden does so horribly at the debate, including stopping in mid-sentence during the debate at one point, trying to, get his thoughts together. Then Biden drops out of the race. Then Kamala Harris gets in the race, and her and Trump were pretty much tied neck and neck. But then he does this interview. And it was on the same day that Kamala Harris had her coming out party with the Megan Thee Stallion performance that we talked about. And the angle that he goes with, and this is how I know Trump looks at the internet. Trump is like an internet junkie, right? He looks at the internet, he looks at, conservative. Oh, Lisa says, no, it wasn't. Well, I watched it the same day, so I figured it was the same day. Obviously, Lisa's coming with new information that it was not the same day. I watched it on the same day, so I figured it was the same day. But anyway, it was shortly after she'd done this. And like I was saying, Trump watches the news. Trump watches the internet. Trump pays attention to the internet. Like I said, and I said this in my 2010's year in review, decade in review video. Trump is a creation, a phenomenon of the internet. You know what I mean? Like he builds his campaign arguments around the internet. Things that he comes up with is stuff that he's heard either on Fox News or conservative blogs, right? Like InfoWars or the Daily Wire or something like that. Because the argument that he comes with is an argument that I heard first on a lot of black websites. And it's the argument that I'm anti-Kamala Harris black websites. It's the argument that Kamala Harris is not black enough. That prior to her political career, she always identified as Indian. In reality, racially speaking, she is half black and half Indian. Her father is Jamaican of African descent. He might be a little bit mixed in within. You know what I mean? He might also have some Indian ancestry. I don't know. But as far as in her book, as she talks about it, he's a black Jamaican. Because you got to remember, even though Jamaica is like 95% black, there are other ethnicities in Jamaica. Syrians, Indians, Chinese, even with some white people. You know what I mean? It's a mixed race nation. The motto of Jamaica is out of many one. And just like the rest of the Caribbean, the people in this society are mixed race. But I think her dad looks black, okay? And her mother is of Indian descent. I don't know if I think she's straight from India, because you got to remember, like with Africa, like with black people, Indian people have a diaspora community as well. You have Indians in East Africa. You have Indians in the West Indies, Indians in Fiji, Indians in Guyana. They make up the majority in Guyana. So, but I think her Lisa's saying, yeah, she's straight from India. I figured that. In her book, she's not so clear on it, but okay, yeah, her dad is Black Jamaican and her her mom is from India. But she identifies, I think she identifies more as being Black because I don't I don't see anything from her. I mean, there are pictures that resurfaced with her wearing a sari, which is a traditional Indian dress. You know, I'm sure if you live in New York City and you've seen East Indian women, they wear this particular dress. It's like a shawl type dress. There's pictures of resurfaced with her wearing that. But you got to remember, when she went to college, she was in a black sorority. Remember, we talked about it. The Kilmaid video, Brian Kilmaid, the colored sorority. Remember, quote unquote. So they have to pick an argument. Either she's not black enough, or she's too black that she's giving, too much attention to this quote unquote black sorority, which is the AKAs. In her pictures from the '80s, she's dressed like your typical, um, you know, black female would be dressed, during that period of time in American history. Typical uh, black female fashion at that particular point in time, the late '80s. So I think she identifies as being Black. There's nothing about her that really screams Indian. She doesn't look Indian. What I mean, that's one thing. Um, and um, Trump is just showing his racism, claiming that she turned black. She didn't turn black. She was born a black woman, but she's emphasizing more her blackness because I think this is what he's getting at, that she's emphasizing her blackness because it's more politically expedient because black people have a there's more black people in America, and black people in America are a stronger political base, particularly for the Democratic Party, than Indian people. I mean, Indian people, depending on their economic status, they tend to vote Republican. I mean, we see it with Nikki Haley, who's half Indian. And that's another point I wanted to bring up. He brings up Kamala Harris's half Indian ancestry, but when he was running against Nikki Haley, no point was made of her half Indian ancestry or Vivek Ramaswamy's pure Indian ancestry. You know what I mean? So Trump is being really selective and really being disingenuous in this because, again, he has no proof that Kamala Harris identifies as Indian or Asian, as it would be racially, because in the racial categories in the census, Indian goes under Asian because India is part of Asia. The Indian subcontinent is part of the Asian larger continent. India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh are part, and Sri Lanka are part of the Asian subgroup. She has no record of identifying that on legal documents. She's always identified as Black or African American. She looks Black or African American. She does not really look Indian. You know what I mean? People that are saying, well, she's more Indian than anything. No, I don't think so. You know what I mean? And let's be honest, even if she were, the Republican Party, if she were a purely Indian woman, the Republican Party would still attack her because they're attacking J.D. Vance's wife, and J.D. Vance's wife is Indian. And people were coming out, racists were coming out of the woodwork saying that, oh, J.D. Vance shouldn't be the nominee for the Republican Party because his wife is Indian. He's a quote unquote race traitor to the white race, not being married to a white woman. Likewise, we saw the interview with Vivek Ramaswamy. Despite Vivek Ramaswamy being the most conservative candidate in the entire primaries for the Republicans, he has an interview with Ann Coulter, and he's coming out. He's saying all these platitudes, talking about how America is a nation of immigrants. What it means to be an American is a creedal identity. America is an idea. It's based on democracy. Anybody can come here. Anybody can be American. American is not based on a bloodline or a nationality per se. And we found, and during that interview, Ann Coulter just comes out and flat out says, "You have no stake in the American dream. Basically, you are an immigrant. Your ancestry is traced back to a foreign land. You shouldn't care about American culture because you are not a true American." You know what I mean? Basically, in so many words, she was trying to say what it means to be an American is to be white. You know what I mean? So he got smacked out of there. Mr. Uber Republican, right, got smacked out of there. So, I mean, really, they're showing people of Indian descent, whether it's people that support. Oh, yes, let's talk about that. Lisa says he was asked by one of the black journalists if it was acceptable that he called her a DEI hire. Now, for those that don't know what a DEI hire is, the DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It basically is the new affirmative action, the new word that they use that means that, oh, well, she's not really qualified. Like when we were kids growing up in the 90s, if somebody wanted to say something racist about a person of color, particularly an African American that was like the only African American in a whole, heap of white people, they would say, "Oh, that's an affirmative action hire," right? Because it was the idea that to make things more equitable due to centuries of discrimination, such as the Jim Crow laws, the companies would be forced to hire, black people or women, right? Or sometimes Hispanics, you know what I mean? Minorities. But it started out with just black people. But eventually, as affirmative action progressed, white women benefited far more from the affirmative action programs than black women or black men. You know, you know what I mean? Because eventually it coalesced and it started to include everybody. And eventually, what always happens with black movements when they start to include everybody, their concerns and the things that they wanted to address initially get pushed to the back, and these other groups take over. You know what I mean? That always happens. That happened during the civil rights movement. That happened, during even Black Lives Matter, which you would think explicitly addresses black issues and black concerns regarding police brutality, eventually shifted to addressing like LGBTQ concerns, of non-black LGBTQ people that had nothing to do with police brutality or black mistreatment. You know what I mean? So that's how affirmative action went. But here's a funny thing, though, Lisa. The real DEI hires are Donald, Eric, and Ivanka. Those are the real DEI hires, Trump's kids. Donald, Eric, and Ivanka. They're the real DEIs because these kids got jobs simply because they were Trump's two sons and his daughter. You know what I mean? They were not qualified at all for the positions that they were in, in his administration. I mean, he put his son-in-law and Ivanka in charge of foreign policy simply because his son-in-law was Jewish. You know what I mean? And he felt he could handle the Middle Eastern situation better than, people that had been studying this shit and been involved in this shit for years. So the real DEI hires, much like the same things with college applications and affirmative action, were the white beneficiaries of legacy hires, right? Because you know somebody, and that's how they got in. That's how anybody gets in into any job, really, and especially the most important jobs. So the real DEA, the real DEI is Donald, Eric, and Ivanka. Keep that in mind, guys. When somebody tells you about DEI, they don't like DEI, right? It's funny how they turn bad things, good things into bad things, right? They turn the word diversity into something bad. They turn the word inclusion into something bad. They turn the word equity into something bad. They turn the word liberal into something bad. They turn the word progressive into something bad. You know what I mean? The Bible speaks of this too. Beware of those who make the good evil and the evil good. You know what I mean? And that's one of the signs of the last days. And that's what I think they're doing in this. You know what I mean? They're trying to make you think that DI is something bad. That DI is nepotism, right? But it's not. You know what I mean? It's an attempt, just like affirmative action was, to level the playing field. Because people like Trump and people, white men in powerful positions, I mean, hey, they give their jobs to their children, even black men in powerful positions. We saw this with LeBron James and his son. You know what I mean? This happens. Oftentimes in your job, whatever, think of any job you've ever gotten in life, no matter where you work. You probably got it off the reference of somebody that you knew previously. So so-called DEI hires give people a chance that wouldn't have had a chance previously. It's nothing to do, it doesn't diminish their qualifications. As a matter of fact, Trump himself only got in office because of his fame in previous arenas in life. He had no political experience whatsoever. Whereas Kamala Harris had to work her way up, right? From the bottom up, right? She didn't know anybody in power necessarily. And don't come with that Willie Brown bullshit story. Because if anything, the affair with Willie Brown would more hurt her in her political aspirations than help her, right? So, you know, oh yeah, um, Trump went on to Trump went on to defend his record with black voters, saying, "I have been the best president for the black population since Abraham Lincoln." No, that is not true. And the journalist said this. One of the journalists said this. She was like, "Well, what about Lyndon Johnson?" Lyndon Johnson. Okay, people say he was a racist, and he probably was. He grew up in Texas in the South as a white man. He probably was racist. Yeah, I know. I know. I heard him say that at least. And I heard what the journalist said in response to him. She said, "Well, what about Lyndon Johnson?" Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 brought an end to Jim Crow segregation in the South. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 brought an end to voters' discrimination in the South that had existed even before the passage of Plessy versus Ferguson, which cemented the separate but equal status in 1894. You know what I mean? So Trump did boost the economy, and of course, a tidal wave lifts all boats, and black people did benefit from his economic boom that he had in the late 2010s. There's no doubt about that. But to claim that you did more than Lyndon Johnson in the struggle for civil rights and black equality in this country is insincere and just plain bullshit. You know what I mean? He wants desperately to appeal to the black voters, you know, which is why he went on this show. And I think he did himself a disservice because no matter how good he tries to appeal to black voters, he's never going to get there because he doesn't have a sound economic plan to appeal to the black community. Now, Ice Cube's platinum plan, that never got picked up because he didn't become the president, right? So, but I doubt he would have did it anyway. He probably just would have been like, okay, yeah, Ice Cube, yeah, he was asked about JD Vance too. And obviously JD Vance, not popular with the black community either. So, you know, I mean, the stuff he said, think about what JD Vance said when he first accepted the nomination for vice president. He said, we're going to appeal to the working class whites and maybe some of the working class black community. So it's showing you that neither Trump nor Vance, yeah, he's not popular with Trump supporters either, Lisa says, and he's not. I'll explain why. Because they view him as a poser and because he is been caught lying about his past, and he's just a very insincere person who once made love to a couch, right? And that story about him fucking the couch, that's in his book. Like, I'm telling you, Kamala Harris needs to come out full force and look at some of these internet memes against Trump and Vance and really, really go at these guys. You know what I mean? Fight them, fight fire with fire. She needs to do that. You know what I'm saying? She got to attack them personally because she can't attack their record because, like I said, their Trump supporters don't care about the record. They care about the character of Trump. So if she attacks Trump's character, she'll win the election. But depending on how she goes about this, you know what I mean? Because there are many people, I think that the largest majority in states like Pennsylvania, states like Michigan, and states like Ohio are largely undecided or will go for Trump on the false promise that he is, going to restore jobs back to middle America. And he has a Midwesterner, J.D. Vance, running for his office. But if Kamala Harris is able to prove that J.D. Vance is not an authentic Midwesterner and did not share the experience of working class Midwesterners, at least, then she could win. But what she cannot do is try to position herself as a coastal elitist. You know what I mean? As somebody who's out of touch with middle America because she's from California. Because like I said in a few other videos before this, coastal elitists, they don't have a good record. People from California or New York, they don't have a good record with winning elections because you don't need to win California and New York as a Democrat to win the election, and you don't need to win it as a Republican because you're never going to win it because they're solid blue states. I mean, they're bluer than my shirt, right? And they're bluer than the bandanas on the people in Snoop Dogg's hometown. You know what I mean? They are solid blue states. There's no way you're going to ever win it as a Republican, so they don't even try. And Democrats don't try with the Midwestern states, but they need to try with the Midwestern states because these states flip back and forth. Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, they flip back and forth. The South doesn't flip back and forth. The South is solid red, and California and New York are solid blue. So you don't have to really worry about those states. You have to worry about California, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. That's why I think Kamala Harris's counter to J.D. Vance should be Gretchen Whitmer. Gretchen Whitmer, she's a Midwestern governor. She's a Midwesterner, and this is going to be the places where they're battling it out because that she needs something on that ticket that will even her out with working class voters, working class white Midwestern voters, because from where she's sitting as a woman, as a hardcore liberal, and as a California native, to the average Midwesterner, she seems like one of those out of touch coastal elites, one of those out of touch Californians that they hate. And they've always hated. We talked about it a lot, like when we talked about wrestling. Remember when we talked about how Billy Graham, superstar Billy Graham, came into the AWA territory, which was the Midwestern territory, and he was a heel, hated, you know what I mean, by the Midwestern audience in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Ohio because he was from California. You know, it's like that in the election cycle too. Like, so she needs something. She needs somebody that will speak to these people. You know what I mean? Like, will speak to their, you know, their concerns. And I think Gretchen Whitmer is the perfect choice. You know, but if not, you know what I mean? She's not going to win the election either. You know, people say, well, what about Trump? He's from New York. How does he in touch with these people? Yeah, but he's online looking at the talking points that they're pointing out, and he's saying everything that they want to hear. You know what I mean? It's like, for example, you're spitting game to a girl, right? Or like you're a girl trying to attract a guy, right? Not necessarily by spitting game, but women do it more with actions, men do it more with words. But if you research everything that person likes before you go on a date with that person, and then you start bringing up all their things that they enjoy, all their interests, like say you go on Pinterest, right? And you look at everything that they like on Pinterest, and you start pretending like you like that stuff too. That's a way to win them, and that's what Trump does with Western voters and white working class voters. It's like he looks at everything they like and they're attracted to and they're into, and he makes his campaign about that. So they forget that he's from New York. You know what I mean? That he's one of those coastal elites that they love to hate on. Oh yeah. Trump was asked in the comments during a Wisconsin rally. A Wisconsin rally uh, in May about giving police immunity protection in relation to the Sonia Massey case. Trump's the Sonia Massey case, for those that don't know, was a woman that was shot in Illinois for allegedly, they said that she threw a pot of water on cops. That she attacked the cops first, and then that's why they shot her. It's not something that we covered on this channel because when it comes to incidents of police brutality or mass shootings, I don't really like to speak about it because I got exhausted. I lived through the 2010s. I got exhausted, and I got a channel like in the mid 2010s, 2016, and I got exhausted talking about all these instances of police brutality and mass shootings. So I stopped covering stuff like that. But and then Lisa says Trump seemed to backtrack and say that the police should not get blanket immunity, and the Chicago shooting did not look good to him. Yeah. Well, he doesn't know anything about it. You know what I mean? Because the site he's looking on doesn't really cover things like that. You know, and if they do, they cover it in a negative way. But he's trying to run a tightrope, at least, because he's trying to appeal to both black and working class white voters, and you really can't. You know, I mean, you're either appealing to working class white voters who are largely racist, you know, in certain parts of the country, especially the Midwest, or you're running as a law and order candidate, which he is, or you're appealing to black voters, you know, who have different concerns, and oftentimes are those concerns and are at odds with the Blue Lives Matter crowd, the Blue Lives Matter or the cops are always right crowd. But suddenly, see, they're hypocritical because when they shot the girl at the Capitol storming, right, Ashley Babbitt, suddenly the cops were the bad guys. Suddenly, it wasn't all about, oh, they're just doing their job. Or if you hadn't moved, maybe they wouldn't have shot you. Suddenly, the cops are the bad guys. I thought this was the Blue Lives Matter crowd. I thought the cops were always right, regardless of what, right? But obviously, that wasn't the case. It's not about law and order. It's not about the rights of the citizen. It's not about the cop fearing for his life. It's really about a white person shooting a black person. As long as the shooter is white and the victim is black, that's all they really care about, right? The hypocrisy got called out once again. Obviously, conservative whites, you know, they have a lot of double standards, and conservatives in general have a lot of double standards. You know, when you call out these arguments, they say, oh, well, it's not the same thing. There's a different circumstances. But when you implore them to look at the circumstances of certain cases, you know what I mean, like Breonna Taylor, like George Floyd, they don't want to look at these circumstances, right? They want to just see it as a grand old narrative. And I agree, some on the left are like that too, because there are instances where, you know, somebody did it, reach for a firearm or whatever, and they got shot because of that. But was the cop being aggressive to her before she did this thing that she was accused of doing? You know what I mean? And is that the appropriate response that a police officer should have to things that didn't threaten their life, right? But only impeded them? Why is it that somebody like Dylan Roof, who shot up a freaking church in Charleston, South Carolina, right? He got taken to Burger King after he did the crime, and somebody who, you know, did less worse than that, for example, got shot, you know, pulling out their wallet. Amadou Diallo in 1999, for example, right? Or Philando Castillo. Or George Floyd, or Eric Garner. You know what I mean? Eric Garner didn't even do anything to the police. They just started choking him. They were just intimidated by his size. Michael Brown, the same thing. You know what I mean? So, of course, Lisa Trump is going to backpedal on it. He backpedals on every comment. Listen, Trump is not politically educated. He doesn't really know about this kind of stuff. All he knows is, I got to get back in power and become the president again in 2024, or else I'm going to jail. I don't think he will go to jail. You know what I'm saying? But that's what motivates him. And another thing I wanted to point out, and he didn't say this during the interview with the black journalist, but he did say this at a rally. He said, just vote for me just this once. And that's all I'm asking for. So basically, it sounded to a lot of people like he was trying to position himself as a dictator, right? Okay, well, I'm getting in now, but I'm not going to get in ever again. Now, obviously, the laws don't provide for that. You know what I mean? But here's the danger. A president is the commander-in-chief. A president is in charge of the armed forces. What if, instead of pledging allegiance to the flag or pledging allegiance to the Constitution of the country, the officers and stuff in the army decide they want to pledge allegiance to the dictator, and that provides a chance for an American dictator to emerge. And Trump's opposition, the Democrats and the liberal states that ban guns and try to institute a bunch of gun control laws that believe that having a gun should be only reserved for those in power, like police and the military, will be at a lost word. Because what can they do if Trump and the MAGA people decide to take over the country from within? When he's already in power, they can't do anything. They're powerless to stop him. What are they going to do? Stop him with protests? Stop him with microaggressions? Shouting him that he's racist? That's not going to help. You know. That's why, in a hypothetical situation where there's a civil war between Republicans and Democrats in this country, Democrats would lose. They have the manpower, but they don't have the willpower. They don't have the will to fight. So they have the numbers, they just don't have the willpower. And numbers don't always win. Just ask just look at history. Look at the American Revolution, for example. The American colonists were outgunned by the British, but the British necessarily didn't see a need to hold on to the American colonies. They were planning to expand their empire to Asia anyway, right? So they really didn't fight with all the fervency that they could have. Plus, they were burned out with several colonial wars with the Spanish and the French that we talked about in other videos. You know what I mean? So, but the Americans had the willpower. The Americans had the fight within them. They wanted to be free. They wanted to be independent. And plus, they had the guns, and they had the home field advantage. They learned how to fight from the natives, how to climb out of trees and how to climb from under hidden fortresses and stuff. Guerrilla warfare, where the British, they just fought like this, standing across from each other, firing, their muskets, and then taking a break for tea time. You know what I mean? So of course the British were going to lose, but the British had the manpower. You know what I mean? They were the largest empire in the world at that point. Still, even early on, the British Empire was established, I would say, in 1588, when they defended their country against the Spanish Armada, during Elizabeth I's reign. So my point being is, you can have the manpower, but you got to have the willpower and the manpower. And Democrats have the manpower, but they don't have the willpower. And they don't have the militaristic mindset that the Trump supporters have. Trump supporters have a militaristic mindset. They're very militaristic. They're very pro-gun. The Democrats don't have that. The Democrats, what are they gonna do? Hide in a Starbucks kiosk? Scream about LGBTQ rights? And microaggressions? No. Okay, let's talk about this black jobs thing. What exactly is a black job? ABC News senior congressional correspondent Rachel Scott quickly followed up. A black job is anybody that has a job, Trump responded. I feel like this black jobs thing, this black jobs complaint, and Lisa and I disagree on this. Lisa and I don't always see eye to eye on everything. I feel like you knew what he meant. You know what I mean? Like, people that are trying to twist, like this journalist, they're trying to twist it around to say that he meant that only certain jobs are available for black people. No, he's not an articulate man. He's not necessarily an intelligent man. He doesn't get his point across all that well, necessarily. But no, I'm saying you don't agree with me, Lisa, because I feel like this wasn't a racist comment. Trump has made racist comments in the past, but I feel like this black job thing wasn't a racist comment. They're trying to make it into something that it wasn't. That's not the way the man meant it. You know what I mean? And I know from our previous discussions offline, you do believe that it was a racist comment, and you do believe he meant it maliciously. I'm not going to defend Trump on everything, but on this, I feel like you knew what he meant. You know what I mean? He meant that these migrants are taking jobs that were previously available to working class and lower class African American people, right? And Hispanic American people. You know that they're doing that. You know what I mean? Anybody could see that. You know, what I mean? What he said was true. He could have expressed it a little bit better. He could have expressed it in economic terms rather than racial terms. Okay, like construction jobs. When you go to a construction site, I just did construction jobs. When you go to a construction site, the vast majority of construction workers now in major metropolitan areas are these migrants, these Mexican and Central American illegal immigrants. You know what I mean? You don't half of the construction workers don't even speak English. You know, and were these migrants not here, these jobs would have been available to lower to middle class African Americans, lower to middle class Hispanic Americans, and lower to middle class white Americans. But they're not because of these migrants, because they work for less. So people, the bosses will want them over Americans that have union jobs. Now, what the part that I disagree with Trump and the Republicans is they want to remove unions entirely from these places. You know what I mean? They want to cut out the unions. They want to dismantle unions. This is part of the Project 2025 initiative, right? This is one of the points of the Project 2025 initiative, where they want to cut out union jobs. You know, they want to cut out unions and they want to dismantle the unions, and that will be less advantageous for the worker and more advantageous for the bosses. If you study in American history and you go back to the Gilded Age, right, the early industrial period from like 1900 to say the mid 1920s, you will see that there were virtually no labor laws. There were no time and a half. There was none of this, right? And what were the conditions? There were even, children as young as 9, as young as 8, working in factories. What were the conditions before unions existed during the time of what they call laissez-faire capitalism? They were atrocious. The unions came in thanks to the Democrats, and they made a lot of reforms. You know what I mean? Reforms that increased the quality of life for the average worker, black, white, Hispanic, whatever. But then during the 1980s, Trump and his party started to undercut the unions, started to dismantle unions, started to bust up the unions. And then their rights got diminished, the rights of the worker. Because what the union does is they advocate on the behalf of the worker. We see professions where there are no unions in them, in like professional wrestling, for example. I know that's a poor example because they're celebrities and they get paid a high percentage rate. At least those that are top earners in the WWE do. But despite that, there are those on the indies and other smaller promotions that don't get paid that. And there's nobody to advocate for them but their own self. And they basically, and also the UFC is the same thing. Uh, you know, Disney was that for a long time too for animators. Disney was famously against unions, and the unions went on strike, and he testified against them in the Council on Un-American Activities, accusing the animators in his movie studio of being communist. You know what I mean? So there are several examples in American history where unions have been beneficial to workers, but Trump and them want to dismantle unions. So they acting like they really care about the workers losing their jobs to these migrants, but they really don't. They're just using them. They're using that type of rhetoric to gain votes. But when he said black jobs, he should have framed it as an economic argument, not framed it as a racial argument. Because then his detractors will turn around and flip it. Well, he meant only black people are designated for this job. But it is true that the influx of these migrants negatively impacts more so those on the lower end of the totem pole socioeconomically for whatever reason. And we know when it comes to African Americans, the reason why they're on the totem pole lower for socioeconomic reasons is because of systemic racism. They were kept there for a specific reason. African Americans were kept out of unions historically. Unions in northern cities, and this is part of the reason why unions got a bad reputation later on after the 20s, right? After say, for example, the American Federation of Labor and Samuel Gompers, right? And other laws that were passed like during FDR's administration, they began to get a bad reputation because they were a lot of times controlled by the mafia, right? The mafia stepped in these northern cities, particularly in New York, and they controlled them, and the unions acted like thugs, pushing people around and stuff. You know what I mean? So the unions got a bad reputation. They got associated with organized crime and racism because they kept a lot of African Americans out of the unions. African Americans were not allowed to join certain unions in northern cities because they didn't have any mob connections. So back in the day, I'm talking about the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, African Americans would be considered as like the migrants are now, like scabs, right? The white workers would go on strike, and the business owners would bring in black workers to still continue to do the task for less wages. And that would, of course, anger the white union workers that were on strike for better working conditions. And it's like, oh, well, we don't need you. You could be on strike forever. We don't really need you. We'll just bring in the black people that were coming from the South. You know what I mean? So you understand how that creates racial tension. But now they don't even need the black people because black people have a certain level of more socioeconomic rights. Now they're like, okay, we don't even need the black people anymore. We'll just bring in people from other countries. And they'll work for even less. They'll work for slave wages even, practically. So yes, the influx of these migrants does negatively affect black employment because, yes, theoretically, a black person can do any job, right? Even a skilled labor, unskilled labor. But being as though economic conditions and economic racism is what it is in this country, the ones that the jobs that these migrants are going to be taking away are sometimes, or used to be anyway, jobs that were occupied primarily before these migrants came by African Americans, especially in urban cities. So Trump didn't know how to explain that or articulate that point necessarily all that well because Trump is Trump. You know what I mean? But I understood what he was saying. People didn't get it. People used it as like, oh, he's saying that black people are only good for this certain job. No, he wasn't saying that. He was saying that The jobs they're taking, because they're not taking away white collar jobs. They're not taking away office jobs that require a high level of skill, but by the vast majority of white people, right? They're not taking over administrative jobs, are they? No, they're taking away unskilled labor jobs, that traditionally, uh, were performed by minorities, partially again for racist reasons, but that's just traditionally the way it was. They're not taking away, um, any jobs from white folk. You know what I mean? They're definitely not doing that. At least not the upper crust of white people, right? The lower class of white people, yes, they are taking away their jobs too. You know what I mean? But hey, it's capitalism, right? Whoever can do it for the least amount of money, let them do it, right? But people are pissed with that. People don't want to hear that. But what's he going to do about it? The thing is with this migrant crisis is that, yeah, Lisa said, Fox, yeah, and in the beginning he said, he says, I like you, Harris. He tried to buddy up to her because she's a black female anchor at Fox News. Well, they have to have the Fox News point of view presented there. And, which is, again, with the migrant thing, going back to my point about the migrants, I feel like people frame this argument about the migrants unfairly. I feel like people frame it as a racist argument. People say that people are racist when they're against these migrants, but I don't feel like Trump will do anything about the migrants. I don't feel like Kamala Harris will do anything about the migrants. This cannot be stopped. These migrants are going to come across the border, whether we have Trump, whether we have Vance, whether we have Harris, or whoever Harris's running mate is. You know what I mean? Whoever these four people are that we're voting for, we're going to have the migrant crisis irregardless of whomever, because the business class doesn't want to get rid of these migrants because, again, they could pay them virtual slave wages and they'll do the same amount of work that American workers, black, white, or Hispanic, will do, but they'll do it for less. You know what I mean? And they're never going to stop doing that unless you punish corporations for employing these people. And they're not going to do that because the Democrats and the Republicans get donations from these big companies. You know what I mean? So it's not going to matter either way. Whether it's Trump, whether it's Harris, whether it's Vance, it's like with the Israel issue. It's not going to matter either way. We're still going to support Israel unequivocally. You know what I mean? So why is this even a talking point? Neither side is going to side with the American worker because the Democrats, like I said, they're elitist for the most part, and they look down on the American worker, and the Republicans are all pro-business. As much as they talk about their working class constituency, the Midwesterner, the forgotten man, the average man and woman in this country, as much as they play up that rhetoric, they too don't side with the American worker. They too forget about the forgotten man when it comes down to it and actually doing something for the American worker. They too have forgotten he or she. Okay, Lisa says, Fox News anchor Harris Faulkner was at this interview. So he was a bit happy. And she's a black woman at Fox News. Wow. Well, yeah. Again, like I said, they have to give the Fox News point of view, which is the conservative point of view. But again, they're not. See, party coalitions are really weird because oftentimes they don't align ideologically with each other, depending on what part of the country you're from. So, for example, Republicans, since, okay, they were founded as an abolitionist party to end slavery during the Civil War. Once that battle was over, most of their constituency remained in the big cities. So they, as these labor battles started to become a high priority, the Republicans sided with the business class over the working class. That's why the Republican symbol is a fat elephant, because they sided with the business owners, the capitalists, getting fat off the labor of the working class, the working man, the donkey, the Democrats. You know what I mean? That's why for generations, the working man and the working woman, their party was the Democrats, irrespective of what race they were. Of course, African Americans who were, again, shut out by these unions and mostly discriminated against by these working class whites, they voted for Republicans because they had a connection to the Republican Party, because the party was the party of Abraham Lincoln, the party was the anti-slavery party, so they were Lincolnite Republicans. Now, to address Trump's point about Abraham Lincoln, I don't think anybody in the modern day, that they look at history now and they say, well, Abraham Lincoln did a lot for black people, right, as the president, but not really, because that wasn't his MO, that wasn't his reason for, well, he didn't start the Civil War, but that wasn't his reason for fighting the Civil War. It wasn't to end slavery, it was to preserve the Union. Because Abraham Lincoln said in his debate, the presidential debate with Douglas, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he said, if I could save the Union by freeing no slaves, I would. If I could save the Union by freeing some of the slaves and keeping others in slavery, I would. In other words, my primary objective is to save the Union, not to free the slaves. And in enslaved states like Kentucky or Missouri, or even West Virginia, that sided with the North, because there were slave states that sided with the North. It's not as clear and as cut and dry as history textbook makes it out to be. Oh, well, there was the Mason-Dixon line, and there was the South and North, and slavery was all in the South and none in the North, or the Union side. That's not necessarily true. There were Union loyal states that were still slave states. And when he enacted the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, he only set free those slaves that were enslaved in southern states, basically territories at that time during the war that he had no jurisdiction over. So, not the ones that he had jurisdiction over, because he didn't want to lose Missouri, Kentucky, or even Maryland, right? That were slave states that were loyal to the North. So, this idea that Abraham Lincoln was this great emancipator, he was not. He did it for an advantageous reason, because he knew that slaves were the production engine behind the South, and that they were the workforce that kept the South going. So if he set them free, they would conceivably leave the plantation, and that would be the end of Southern industry, because the entirety of Southern industry was built on slave labor, whereas the entirety of Northern industry was built on free labor, mostly of immigrants. You know what I mean? This is why Republicans during this time, during the 1860s, were majority for the business owners and against the immigrants, against like the immigrant Irish, or the immigrants, well, mostly the Irish during that time, because that was, during from the 1840s to the 1860s was the Irish potato famine, where the British Empire basically tried to starve out all of Ireland, and a lot of Irish Catholics started to come to this country. But most Republicans during that point of time were anti-immigrant. They had know nothing parties, secret parties that were set up to oppose immigration from specifically Ireland. And when police would ask them about it, it was like an American version of Omerta, which is the secret oath that the mafia takes. It was like, oh, I know nothing. You know what I mean? I don't know nothing about these parties. But so basically, my point in saying that is that it has always been the case in this country that African American, foundational Black Americans whose roots are you know, in American slavery, have been set up against immigrants. It's always been that way. You know what I mean? Those who sided with immigrants were seen as taking away the jobs or the positions of African Americans. The South didn't want a large influx of other types of nationalities, Catholics or Jews, right, from Europe. So they continued even after slavery in a system of exploitation of African Americans, which got into sharecropping after slavery. You know what I mean? Because they didn't want to rely on the industry like the North, because they saw the exploitation of immigrants as far worse what the democratic cities and the democratic states were doing to the white immigrant workers. They saw it as far worse, and they saw themselves as benevolent. So this idea is that we as conservatives care more about Black people than you in the North do, because look at how you exploit them, or we care more about people of color. This argument is an old argument. This argument was used during slavery. This was used during the antebellum period. Like, look at us, we take care of our slaves, we feed our slaves, we clothe our slaves, we house our slaves. And look at how you, the North, are doing, your workers up there, your immigrant workers, the Irish and then later the Jews and the Italians. You don't give them any rights. You have them in factories working all hours of the day and night. You have kids working, chopping off their hands with machinery. Well, at the same time, come on, as bad as that was, that's not nearly as bad as slavery. You know what I mean? So. But yeah, I feel like Black conservatives, like that news anchor lady Lise, I feel like they don't really have any original arguments. Most of their arguments are just stuff that white conservatives say. Like the idea, and I've said this in other videos, but I'll say it again. I'll reiterate it here. No, I don't. This says, do I think it was smart of him to do this conference? No, I don't. Because again, this idea that somehow Black people are going to switch back to the Republican Party, and the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln is not the same Republican Party that exists today. I'm tired of it, and I know I addressed this before, but I'm tired of hearing it. The idea that the Dems are the real racist, and that the KKK was founded by the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party was the party of slavery and segregation, is true. But they leave this part out. And it's this. What happens after 1968? First in 1964, President Johnson gets elected unanimously because he's riding off the goodwill of people feeling sympathy for his administration, because JFK was the president that he served under, just was assassinated the year before. Some say if JFK had not been assassinated, and I hold the true to this, he might not have been reelected for a second term because he completely botched the Bay of Pigs invasion to overthrow Fidel Castro. But that's a moot point because Kennedy died. So, but during that election, even though Johnson completely destroyed his opponent, Barry Goldwater, certain southern states went for Barry Goldwater. And the reason they did was because Barry Goldwater, who was senator from Arizona at the time, was against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because he saw it as a violation of business owners' right, quote unquote, to discriminate against who they wanted to serve and not serve. So he was saying that. But the segregationist Democrats, who already had a problem, because eventually, over time, of course, Southerners would always side with Democrats because it's true that Abraham Lincoln's party, the Republican Party, was the party that ended slavery. Whatever Abraham Lincoln's intentions were, irrespective of that, they did it. So, of course, the South held it against them, right, for doing it. So, of course, they never voted Republican ever. So, from 1865 till about 1965, for about 100 years, the South was solidly Democratic. It was called the Solid South. Until this election in 1964, where several southern states went for Barry Goldwater. So what the Democrats figured out, what the Republicans figured out, they were like, okay, we're never going to win another election unless we start to appeal to these racist white voters who, again, over time became a minority within their own party, to the point that before this, in 1948, at the Democratic National Convention, there was a split between Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats. The Southern Democrats were called the party of the Dixiecrats. Strom Thurmond, who was their spokesperson, he actually walked out of the Democratic National Convention when Truman was being reelected at that time because he didn't agree with the direction that the party was going, which was starting to appeal to more black voters in the North and starting to advocate for black voters. So that they created like two Democratic parties, one the Dixiecrats and one the regular Northern Liberal Democrats. Eventually that was solved after Johnson made that choice, that brave choice. Again, we don't know his reasons. You know what I mean? Because people will say, well, Johnson was racist too. And Republicans, modern day Republicans, always use this quote. They always say, well, Johnson said, well, I'll have those N-words voting for me for the next 100 years if I pass this bill. So basically, they're insinuating that Johnson was only using this tactic to gain black votes, right? But again, we don't know his intentions because he didn't state his intentions. So regardless of his intentions, he did it. You know what I mean? And this angered the loyal constituency of Democrats, the loyal white constituency, racist white constituency part of the Democratic Party. And over time, the Republicans figured out, look, the way to win elections is to cater to these voters. And they created what was called the Southern Strategy to get white racist Democrats to switch over to the Republican side, right? To switch, a party switch. And that's exactly what happened. It didn't happen, and people say, well, it didn't happen overnight because it didn't happen in the 68 election. It happened in the 68 election, right? We talked about that election. Johnson drops out kind of like now, and then people didn't expect Nixon to win, and Nixon does. It didn't really happen overnight. Kind of happened then. That's when they started doing it. But Jimmy Carter gets elected in 76, his election, right? Because Ford didn't get elected. Ford was put in there because he was the Speaker of the House. Spiro Agnew was the vice president. He got kicked out. Nixon also resigned. So the next time they had an election with two different candidates was 76, and a lot of the South still went for Jimmy Carter, the Democratic candidate. He was a Southerner himself from Georgia, right? So they still sympathized with him. But by the 1980s, and Reagan knew this, Reagan was better at this than even Nixon, because Reagan started his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the same exact city where three civil rights workers, two white guys, two Jewish white guys, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwimmer, and a black guy, James Chaney, were lynched during Freedom Summer to get the right to vote in the mid 60s. And Reagan knew that this was the city. And what does he say? What does he say during that speech? He says, "I am a president that is for states' rights." And they knew instantly, these white racist, formerly Democratic, now Republican voters knew instantly what he meant. The argument for states' rights has always been the argument for white supremacy in this country. That's the argument that pro-slavery slave owners used during the Civil War. They never said outright that they were seceding from the Union because Lincoln had threatened, to abolish slavery. They said they were seceding for states' rights. The pro-segregationists during the 60s, like Strom Thurmond and later George Wallace, always said that they were arguing for states' rights, the right to impose individual state laws that discriminate against African Americans. So this argument of states' rights, I believe in states' rights. People knew what this meant. The same thing with the argument for law and order. People know that law and order doesn't mean law and order in a literal sense. It's a dog whistle. It means one thing, but it says another thing implicitly. What does it imply? What's the hidden meaning? The idea is that black people are criminals, and if you have tougher law and order, you will have tougher laws that discriminate against African Americans. So this is coded language. And a master at this was the campaign manager for both George Bush Sr. in 1988 and then during his 1988 campaign, and Ronald Reagan during his 1984 and 1980 and 1984 campaigns. And this was Lee Atwater. And there's an interview with Lee Atwater in which he says, and I quote, "We start off in 1958 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. But by 1960, you can't say N-word anymore, so you start making it more of a hidden argument, like busing, right?" And then he goes, "Well, now even the busing is too obvious. Now you have to start talking about taxes. Now you have to start talking about law and order and these other hidden words. But even though you're not saying anything about race explicitly, you're implying it, and the people know what you mean." You know what I mean? But you can still cop out and be like, "Oh, I didn't mean that." You know what I mean? I meant something else. I meant law and order. I meant tough on crime. People know that you're talking about instituting laws that target African Americans. So what he's trying to do now, Trump, to bring it back to the original premise of this video, is that he's trying to insinuate that she's not black enough. That she is an Uncle Tom, basically, that she doesn't understand the black experience. Well, my question to Trump would be, well, if she's not black enough, right, and she doesn't understand the black experience, then how do you understand it more when you're a white man? So now they've shifted the strategy since Trump, because Trump was, during his 2016 campaign and especially during his 2020 campaign, he did pick up the largest amount of black voters that any Republican candidate has ever picked up since 1968. You know what I mean? So they're especially among men, because his anti-feminist rhetoric appeals to certain men across the board, black, white, Hispanic, whatever, the fact that he is against this this onslaught of anti-masculinity appeals to certain people. And I ain't gonna front, at times, even though I know it's all bullshit and it's all a smokescreen, but as a man, sometimes these arguments appeal to me as well. You know what I mean? Because a lot of times you see, but that's why you gotta read in between the lines, guys. You see this stuff, and if you see it as it truly is, you're like, oh, this shit is crazy. Why are we doing this in society? Like when you hear, for example, right, you're a regular guy and you have children, and you hear like, oh well, they're instituting these mandatory drag queen story hours, right? And you're like, oh, this is crazy. Why would they allow drag queens to come into kids' schools and read them stories? Like, why is this happening? But then you look deeper into it and you hear, well, the parents knew about it and they were okay with it. So if they're okay with it, who am I to say what they're going to do with their kids? But again, you hear these stories, and if you don't have proper discernment and you don't have the proper ability to look at these things intellectually, you're going to get caught up in this. You know what I mean? And it happened to me in 2016. I'm like, man, they're really pushing this anti-male agenda really far. You know what I mean? Like, they're really trying to like make women men and men women. You know what I mean? Like, this is crazy. You know what I mean? You look at a guy like Trump and you're like, okay, well, he's a voice of sanity in all of this. You know what I mean? Because he's against this. But then you realize, wait a minute, that's not what they're doing at all. Like that's not the truth. And it still happens to me today. I heard about this Olympic story, right? And I'm like, at first, before Lisa gave me all the specifics about this case, I'm like, this is crazy. A trans boxer in the ring with a biological woman, like what's going on? But then you're like, oh, wait a minute, that's not really what that was. You know what I mean? Like, so the appeal of Trump is like the appeal, the same thing with the appeal of Andrew. Yeah, Lisa didn't want me to bring that up, but I feel like um I wanted to just say that. Uh but the appeal of Trump is like his appeal to that sense of normalcy, for people that in a changing world, right? The world is changing so rapidly that a lot of people can't grasp how much is changing. So I think that's why a lot of guys, voted for him for that reason. He also did get a lot of votes from women, during his 2016 campaign anyway. And I don't know how things will change in the 2024 election. I don't know, especially with this whole Roe v. Wade. I can't see a lot of women being on board with that. But again, who shut down the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s? Phyllis Schlafly, a woman. So, I mean, you never underestimate the kind of power that the opposition has. Anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see my next videos coming out. Love you guys. Peace. Thank you, Lisa, for contributing.